The day the US lost Venezuela and didn't even notice. Let me take you back to March 18, 2024. That was the day the Biden administration quietly lifted a set of sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, allowing Chevron and other US firms to resume limited operations in the country. The official reason? A step toward democracy, following Venezuela's agreement to hold elections later this year. The media dutifully reported it as a minor diplomatic adjustment, a footnote in the broader chaos of global energy markets. But here's what they didn't tell: that day marked the first time in over a decade that the United States formally conceded ground in its own backyard to a regime it had spent years trying to overthrow. And worse, it did so without securing a single meaningful concession in return. I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of energy, geopolitics, and U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. I was in Caracas in 2002 when the Bush administration backed a failed coup against Hugo Chavez. I was in Washington in 2019 when the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, a move that now looks like a case study in diplomatic hubris. And I can tell you what happened in March wasn't just a policy shift. It was an admission of defeat. The question is, what comes next, and why is no one in Washington treating this like the strategic earthquake it is? The official what they want you to believe. The story the White House wants you to accept as sanctions relief was a calculated gamble to incentivize Nicolas Maduro to hold free and fair elections. The logic goes like: squeeze Venezuela economically, then offer a carrot, limited sanctions relief, in exchange for democratic reforms. It's classic smart power, a middle path between the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign and the Obama-era engagement that critics called too soft. The numbers seem to back this up, at least on the surface. Venezuela's economy has been in freefall since 2014, with GDP shrinking by over 75% and inflation hitting a mind-boggling 1 million% at its peak. The U.S. sanctions, particularly the 2019 oil embargo, accelerated the collapse, cutting off Maduro's primary source of revenue. By 2023, Venezuela's oil production had plummeted to just 700,000 barrels per day, down from 3.5 million in 1998. The country was a shadow of its former self, a petrostate reduced to bartering oil for Iranian condensate and Chinese credit. Then came the Barbados Agreement in October 2023, where Maduro's government and the opposition signed a deal to hold elections in 2024 under international observation. The Biden administration, desperate for a foreign policy win ahead of the 2024 election and facing rising gas prices, saw an opportunity. In exchange for Maduro allowing some opposition candidates to run, the U.S. would ease sanctions on Venezuela's oil, gold, and financial sectors. The media played along. The New York Times ran a piece titled "U.S. Eases Sanctions on Venezuela in Bid to Foster Democratic Elections." CNN framed it as a diplomatic breakthrough. Even some Venezuela experts, like Francisco Rodriguez at the University of Denver, argued that the move was a rational response to Maduro's willingness to negotiate. The narrative was the U.S. was being pragmatic, not weak. Maduro was being brought to heel. But here's the problem with this: it assumes Maduro is a rational actor who responds to incentives. He isn't. And it assumes the U.S. is in control of the situation. It isn't. Deconstructing what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact number 1, Maduro has no intention of losing power. The idea that Maduro would ever allow a free election he could lose is laughable. Since taking power in 2013, he has systematically dismantled Venezuela's democratic institutions. The 2018 election that kept him in office was widely condemned as a sham. The 2020 legislative elections were boycotted by the opposition after the government banned their most popular candidates. And in 2024? Maduro has already disqualified Machado, the opposition's strongest contender, from running. The elections in July will be neither free nor fair, just ask the Carter Center, which pulled out of observing them, calling the conditions unfavorable. So why did Maduro agree to the Barbados deal? Because he needed sanctions relief, not to hold elections, but to survive. The sanctions were crippling, but they weren't enough to topple him. What they did do was force him to get creative. And that's where the real story begins. Fact number 2, Venezuela's economy was never as weak as it seemed. The mainstream narrative assumes that Venezuela's economic collapse was solely the result of U.S. sanctions and Maduro's mismanagement. That's partially true, but it ignores a critical: Venezuela never stopped selling oil. It just stopped selling it to the U.S. Between 2019 and 2023, Venezuela rerouted its oil exports to China, India, and even Europe. The volumes were smaller, but the profits were still flowing, just not to the US or its allies. By 2023, Venezuela was exporting around 600,000 barrels per day, with China taking the lion's share. The US sanctions hurt, but they didn't strangle the regime. They just forced Maduro to diversify his customer base. And here's the: China and Russia didn't just buy Venezuela's oil, they helped Maduro evade sanctions. Chinese state-owned firms like CNPC and Rosneft provided technical support to keep Venezuela's refineries running. Russian banks facilitated payments. Iranian tankers delivered condensate to blend with Venezuela's heavy crude. The US thought it was isolating Venezuela. Instead, it was pushing Maduro into the arms of America's adversaries. Fact number 3: the U.S. sanctions relief was a gift, not a negotiation. The Biden administration framed the March 2024 sanctions relief as a quid pro: Maduro gets economic breathing room, and in return, he holds elections. But here's the thing: Maduro didn't actually give up anything. He didn't release political prisoners. He didn't allow Machado to run. He didn't commit to a transparent electoral process. He didn't even agree to a timeline for lifting the remaining sanctions. All he did was allow a few opposition candidates to participate in a rigged election. That's not a concession, that's a hostage negotiation where the hostage taker gets paid up front. And the US? It got nothing. No guarantees. No leverage. Just the vague hope that Maduro might, maybe, someday, consider not stealing the election. If that's the best the world's sole superpower can do, then we're in deeper trouble than I thought. Fact number 4: the real motive wasn't democracy, it was oil. So why did the Biden administration do this? The official reason is democracy. The real reason? Energy security and fear of China. By early 2024, global oil markets were tightening. The war in Ukraine had disrupted Russian supplies. OPEC Plus was cutting production. U.S. shale growth was slowing. And Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves, was sitting on a goldmine if only the U.S. could get its hands on it. But there was: China was already there. By 2023, China was importing more Venezuelan oil than ever before, paying in yuan and bartering for infrastructure projects. If the U.S. didn't act fast, Venezuela's oil would become a permanent Chinese asset, just like Iran's, just like Russia's. The sanctions relief wasn't about democracy. It was about reasserting U.S. influence in its own hemisphere before China locked it out for good. And here's the dirty little: it's already too late. The geopolitical: how Venezuela became a Chinese-Russian proxy. Let me tell you something that should keep every U.S. policymaker up: Venezuela is no longer a U.S. problem. It's a Chinese and Russian opportunity. For decades, the U.S. treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could intervene at will. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just policy, it was dogma. But in the last 10 years, that dogma has collapsed. And Venezuela is the epicenter of the shift. China's the new oil empire. China didn't just buy Venezuela's oil, it rebuilt its energy infrastructure. Between 2018 and 2023, Chinese firms invested over $10 billion in Venezuela's oil sector. Upgrading the El Palito refinery. Building a new heavy oil upgrader in the Orinoco Belt. Financing a new deepwater port in La Guaira, capable of handling VLCCs bound for Asia. And that's just oil. China has taken over Venezuela's gold mines. Built a satellite tracking station in the Andes. Deployed private security contractors to protect Chinese workers and assets. The result? Venezuela's economy is now structurally dependent on China. And unlike the US, China doesn't care about democracy. It cares about resources, markets, and geopolitical leverage. Russia's the military foothold. Russia's involvement in Venezuela is even more brazen. Since 2019, Moscow deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela on multiple occasions, including in 2018 and 2022. Stationed Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces and protect Maduro. Sold Venezuela $11 billion worth of arms, including S-300 air defense systems, T-72 tanks, and Su-30 fighter jets. Helped Venezuela evade sanctions by facilitating oil-for-goods swaps and using Russian banks to process payments. In 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a military cooperation agreement that allows Russian warships to dock in Venezuelan ports without prior notice. This isn't just about oil, it's about projecting power into the US's southern flank. And here's the Russia is using Venezuela as a testing ground for hybrid warfare. In 2020, U.S. intelligence agencies reported that Russian operatives were helping Maduro's regime conduct cyber attacks on U.S. energy infrastructure. In 2021, a Russian-linked disinformation campaign flooded Latin American social media with anti-U.S. propaganda, amplifying Venezuela's narrative that the U.S. was behind its economic collapse. The new Cold War in the Americas. What we're seeing in Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a proxy war. And the U.S. is losing. For China, Venezuela is a resource colony, a way to secure oil supplies outside the U.S. dollar system. For Russia, it's a military outpost, a way to threaten the U.S. from its own neighborhood. And for the U.S.? It's a strategic disaster. A country that was once its closest ally in Latin America is now a hostile forward operating base for its greatest adversaries. And the worst part? The U.S. helped make it happen. Military: how Venezuela became a threat to U.S. security. Let me be: Venezuela is not an existential threat to the U.S. It's not the Soviet Union. It's not even Iran. But it is a serious strategic liability, one that could tie down U.S. forces, disrupt energy markets, and provide a staging ground for attacks on U.S. interests. 1. The military: Venezuela's capabilities. Venezuela's military is a shadow of its former self, but it's still dangerous. Here's what it: Air 24 Su-30 Mk2 fighters, 10 Mi-35 attack helicopters, and a handful of aging F-16s. 2 diesel-electric submarines, 6 frigates, and a fleet of fast attack craft. Air S-300 VM and Buk M2 systems. Missile: short-range ballistic missiles and anti-ship missiles. Most of this equipment is poorly maintained, but it doesn't need to be perfect to be effective. In a conflict, Venezuela: threaten U.S. naval operations in the Caribbean. Conduct limited airstrikes on U.S. bases in Colombia or the Dutch Antilles. Launch cyber attacks on U.S. energy infrastructure. 2. The escalation: what if the U.S. tries to remove Maduro? The hawks in Washington, particularly in the Republican Party, have been pushing for a more aggressive approach to Venezuela. Some have called for military intervention. Others have advocated for arming the opposition. Both ideas are catastrophically stupid. Here's: Venezuela is not Libya or Iraq. It has air defenses, a functional navy, and Russian advisors. A U.S. intervention would not be a surgical strike, it would be a prolonged, bloody conflict. China and Russia would respond. Beijing has already warned that any U.S. military action in Venezuela would be seen as a direct threat to Chinese interests. Moscow has said the same. Do we really want to risk a direct confrontation with 2 nuclear powers over a country that's already lost? The opposition is divided. Even if the U.S. armed them, they have no unified command structure. The last time the U.S. tried regime change in Venezuela, it failed spectacularly. There's no reason to think this time would be different. The regional backlash would be severe. Latin American countries, even U.S. allies like Colombia and Brazil, would condemn a U.S. invasion. The OAS would fracture. The U.S. would be isolated. 3. The real hybrid warfare. The bigger danger isn't a conventional war, it's asymmetric conflict. Venezuela, with Russian and Iranian help, has already demonstrated its ability. Conduct cyber attacks on U.S. energy infrastructure. Flood the U.S. with fentanyl and cocaine. Infiltrate U.S. politics. This is the new face of warfare: not tanks and planes, but drugs, disinformation, and cyber attacks. And the US is woefully unprepared. The domestic political why Biden can't afford to lose Venezuela. Foreign policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Every decision is shaped by domestic politics, and Venezuela is no exception. 1. The 2024 gas prices in Florida. Biden's approval ratings are underwater. Inflation is still high. And gas prices? They're the single biggest economic issue for voters. In 2022, the Biden administration released 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to lower prices ahead of the midterms. It worked temporarily. But now, the SPR is at its lowest level since 1983. Enter Venezuela. The administration's calculation was lift sanctions, let Chevron and other U.S. firms back in, and bring more oil to market. The hope was that this would lower gas prices just in time for the 2024 election. But it won't work. Venezuela's oil production is still a fraction of what it was in the 1990s. Even if it ramps up to 1 million BPD, that's only 1% of global supply. It won't move the needle on gas prices. Worse, the move alienated key voters in Florida. The Venezuelan American community, one of the fastest growing voting blocs in the state, hates Maduro. They see the sanctions relief as a betrayal. And Florida is a must-win state for Biden. If he loses it, he loses the election. 2. The progressive versus hawk divide. Inside the Democratic Party, there's a growing split over Venezuela. The progressives, led by figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have long argued that U.S. sanctions hurt ordinary Venezuelans and should be lifted. The hawks, like Senator Bob Menendez, insist that sanctions are the only way to pressure Maduro. Biden is trying to thread the needle, lift some sanctions, but keep enough pressure to force Maduro to hold concessions on free and fair elections. But Maduro has no intention of playing along. He's seen this movie before. Obama tried the same thing in 2015, easing sanctions in exchange for dialogue, only for Maduro to jail opposition leaders and rig the next election. The Biden administration is repeating the same mistake, and Maduro knows it. He's not negotiating in good faith, he's buying time. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil or Florida voters. The real stakes are geopolitical, and they extend far beyond Venezuela's borders. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela is the linchpin of a much larger contest for influence in Latin America, a region the U.S. has taken for granted for decades. The Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions wasn't just about gas prices, it was a desperate attempt to counter China and Russia's growing footprint in what Washington still calls its backyard. But here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is losing that contest, and Venezuela is the clearest example of why. Take China first. Beijing has been quietly embedding itself in Latin America's energy and infrastructure sectors for years, but Venezuela is where it's made its boldest moves. Since 2007, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it repaid in oil. Those loans kept Maduro's regime afloat during the worst years of U.S. sanctions, and in return, China secured long-term access to Venezuela's crude. Today, China is Venezuela's largest creditor and its second-largest trading partner after the U.S. itself. And it's not just oil. Chinese firms are building ports, upgrading refineries, and even developing Venezuela's gold mines. The message is, while the U.S. imposes sanctions, China invests. Then there's Russia. Moscow's relationship with Caracas goes beyond energy, it's military. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force that rattled Washington. More recently, in 2022, Maduro announced that Russia would help Venezuela modernize its military, including the purchase of Russian fighter jets and air defense systems. This isn't just about hardware, it's about signaling. Russia is telling the U.S. that it has a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, just 1,500 miles from Florida. And it's working. The U.S. Southern Command has repeatedly warned Congress that Russia's presence in Venezuela poses a direct threat to U.S. security. But what has the U.S. done about it? Very little. Here's why this matters. The U.S. has spent the last 3 decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, something to be managed with occasional aid packages, drug interdiction programs, and the occasional coup when a leftist government got too uppity. But China and Russia don't see it that way. For them, Latin America is a critical battleground in their broader competition with the US. And they're playing a long game, one that doesn't rely on military force but on economic leverage, infrastructure projects, and strategic partnerships. Venezuela is the perfect case study. The US sanctions regime, which was supposed to cripple Maduro, has instead pushed him into the arms of America's adversaries. China gets cheap oil. Russia gets a military ally in the Caribbean. And the US? It gets higher gas prices, a divided electorate, and a growing sense that its influence in the region is slipping away. Now, let's talk about the military implications. Most Americans don't realize this, but Venezuela is one of the most militarized countries in Latin America. Maduro has spent years consolidating control over the armed forces, purging dissenters, and embedding loyalists in key positions. The result is a military that is deeply politicized, heavily armed, and increasingly aligned with Russia and China. This isn't just about tanks and fighter jets, it's about the kind of asymmetric warfare the US has struggled to counter. Consider the following. Venezuela's military has been training with Russian and Iranian advisors for years. They've conducted joint exercises with Russia's Wagner Group, the same mercenaries who fought in Ukraine. They've received Iranian drones, which could be used for surveillance or even attacks on US assets in the region. And they've been stockpiling weapons, everything from AK-103 rifles to advanced air defense systems. The US Southern Command has warned that Venezuela's military buildup is designed to deter US intervention, but it also serves another to project power beyond its borders. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela is becoming a forward operating base for America's adversaries. If the US ever found itself in a conflict with China or Russia, Venezuela could be used to harass US shipping in the Caribbean, disrupt communications, or even launch cyber attacks. And because the US has no real military presence in the region, its bases in Colombia and Honduras are limited in scope, it would have few options for a rapid response. This is the new reality of great power competition. The US is used to fighting wars in the Middle East, where it can rely on air superiority and overwhelming firepower. But in Latin America, the rules are different. The battles won't be fought with tanks and planes, they'll be fought with drugs, disinformation, and cyber attacks. And the US is woefully unprepared. Let me give you an example. In 2020, the US Treasury Department accused Venezuela of using cryptocurrency to evade sanctions and fund its military. That same year, the DEA warned that Venezuela was becoming a hub for drug trafficking, with Maduro's inner circle directly involved in shipping cocaine to the US and Europe. And in 2021, the US charged Maduro with narco-terrorism, accusing him of flooding the US with drugs in exchange for cash and weapons. This isn't just criminal activity, it's a form of warfare. And it's working. The US response? Sanctions, indictments, and the occasional military exercise. But sanctions don't work when the target has powerful backers like China and Russia. Indictments don't deter a regime that has already been cut off from the global financial system. And military exercises don't change the fact that the US has no coherent strategy for countering Venezuela's hybrid warfare. Here's what the US should be doing instead. First, it needs to recognize that Venezuela is not just a domestic political problem, it's a national security threat. That means treating it with the same urgency as Iran or North Korea. Second, it needs to counter China and Russia's influence in the region, not by imposing more sanctions, but by offering Latin American countries a better alternative. That means investment, trade, and infrastructure projects that actually benefit local economies, not just US corporations. Third, it needs to modernize its military posture in the region. The US has neglected its bases in Latin America for decades, and it shows. It's time to rebuild them, not just for counter-narcotics operations, but for great power competition. But none of this will happen as long as the US remains distracted by its domestic political divisions. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy is a perfect example of how short-term thinking undermines long-term strategy. They lifted sanctions to lower gas prices, but they didn't consider the geopolitical consequences. They tried to thread the needle between progressives and hawks, but they ended up satisfying no one. And they assumed that Maduro would play along, but he's playing them instead. The result is a policy that is incoherent, inconsistent, and ultimately self-defeating. And the worst part? It's not just Venezuela. The same dynamic is playing out across Latin America, from Nicaragua to Cuba to Bolivia. The US is losing influence, and its adversaries are gaining ground. And unless something changes, that trend will only accelerate. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a failure of foreign policy, it's a symptom of a much deeper dysfunction in Washington. The US political establishment has spent decades treating Latin America as an afterthought, a region to be managed rather than engaged, and Venezuela has become the perfect case study in why that approach is doomed to fail. The problem isn't just that the Biden administration lacks a coherent strategy, it's that the entire US political class has lost the ability to think strategically about the hemisphere at all. Let me explain why this matters. For the past 30 years, US policy toward Latin America has been defined by two competing: the progressive desire to avoid intervention at all costs, and the hawkish instinct to treat every leftist government as a Soviet-style threat. Neither approach has worked, because neither is rooted in an understanding of the region's actual dynamics. Progressives assume that if the US just leaves Latin America alone, democracy and stability will flourish on their own. Hawks assume that if the US just cracks down hard enough, authoritarian regimes will collapse. Both are wrong, and both have left the US unprepared for the reality of what's happening: a region where China and Russia are writing the rules, and where US influence is eroding not because of some grand conspiracy, but because of sheer neglect. Here's the uncomfortable: the US hasn't had a serious Latin America strategy since the Cold War. The last time Washington actually tried to shape the region's trajectory was under Reagan, when the administration saw Central America as a battleground against Soviet action. Even then, the approach was flawed. Supporting right-wing dictatorships in the name of anti-communism didn't exactly endear the US to the region's people, but at least it was a strategy. Since then? Nothing. The Clinton administration treated Latin America as a free trade zone, the Bush administration was too busy with the Middle East to care, and Obama oscillated between cautious engagement and outright disengagement. Trump, for all his bluster about socialism and immigration, had no real interest in the region beyond using it as a political punching bag. And now Biden? He's inherited a mess, and his administration's response has been to default to the same old sanctions, occasional diplomatic overtures, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. The result is a policy that's reactive, not proactive. When Maduro held sham elections in 2018, the US recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president, a bold move, but one that was never backed up with real leverage. When the Biden administration lifted sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2023, it was a desperate attempt to lower gas prices ahead of the midterms, not part of any broader strategy. And when Maduro responded by cracking down even harder on opposition figures and doubling down on his alliances with China and Russia, the US had no answer. Why? Because Washington still doesn't understand that Maduro isn't just a thug, he's a rational actor playing a weak hand brilliantly. He knows the US is divided, distracted, and unwilling to take real risks in the region. So he pushes and pushes and pushes until the US either backs down or looks foolish. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions of this mess, because they're just as important as the geopolitical ones. The US can't have a coherent Venezuela policy, or a coherent Latin America policy, for that matter, because its own political system is too fractured to sustain one. On the left, progressives see Venezuela as a cautionary tale about US imperialism, and they're not entirely wrong. The history of US intervention in Latin America is ugly, and it's left deep scars. But their solution, disengagement, is just as flawed as the hawk's obsession with regime change. On the right, the narrative is even more: Maduro is a socialist dictator, and socialism is always and everywhere a failure. Never mind that Venezuela's collapse had as much to do with corruption and mismanagement as it did with ideology. Never mind that some of the US's closest allies in the region, like Colombia and Brazil, have leftist governments that Washington has no choice but to work with. The right's answer is always the sanctions, sanctions, and more sanctions. The problem is that neither side is willing to do the hard work of actually understanding Venezuela or Latin America more broadly. Progressives want to believe that if the US just stops interfering, the region will sort itself out. Hawks want to believe that if the US just applies enough pressure, the bad guys will go away. Both are fantasies. The reality is that Latin America is a complex, diverse region with its own agency, its own interests, and its own internal power struggles. The US can't control it, but it can't ignore it either. And right now, it's doing neither. So what happens next? Let's game out a few scenarios. The most likely one is that the US continues to muddle through, alternating between half-hearted sanctions and equally half-hearted diplomatic overtures, while Maduro consolidates his power and deepens his ties with China and Russia. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a permanent thorn in the US's side, a rogue state that's too weak to be a major threat but too stubborn to be ignored. The US will continue to lose influence in the region, not because of some grand Chinese or Russian master plan, but because it's too distracted by its own dysfunction to offer a compelling alternative. A second scenario is that the US finally wakes up and adopts a more coherent strategy, one that treats Venezuela as a national security priority, not just a political football. This would mean rebuilding US influence in the region through investment, trade, and infrastructure projects that actually benefit local economies, rather than just US corporations. It would mean modernizing the US military presence in Latin America, not to prepare for some hypothetical invasion, but to counter the very real hybrid threats posed by China, Russia, and their proxies. And it would mean recognizing that the US can't just lecture Latin American countries about democracy and human rights while ignoring their economic and security concerns. This scenario is possible, but it would require a level of bipartisan cooperation and strategic thinking that Washington hasn't shown in decades. The third scenario is the most: a direct confrontation between the US and Venezuela, either by accident or by design. This could happen if Maduro overplays his hand, say, by cracking down even harder on the opposition, or by allowing Russian or Iranian military assets into Venezuela. It could also happen if a future US administration, frustrated by the lack of progress, decides to take more aggressive action, like a naval blockade or even a limited military strike. This scenario is unlikely, but it's not impossible, and it's the one that keeps me up at night. The last thing the US needs is another forever war, especially in its own backyard. The bottom line is the US is losing ground in Latin America not because its adversaries are 10 feet tall, but because it's too busy looking in the mirror to see what's happening right in front of it. Venezuela is a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that won't be solved until Washington stops treating Latin America as a sideshow and starts treating it as a priority. That means investing in the region, engaging with its governments, and offering a better alternative to the Chinese and Russian models. It means recognizing that the US can't just lecture Latin America about democracy while ignoring its economic struggles. And it means having the humility to admit that the US doesn't always know what's best for the region, but sometimes, the best thing it can do is listen. But none of that will happen as long as US politics remains as polarized and dysfunctional as it is today. Until then, Maduro will keep playing the US like a fiddle, China and Russia will keep extending their influence, and the US will keep wondering why it's losing ground. The question: how much more will it lose before it finally wakes up? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of a grand strategy that Washington has taken for granted since the end of the Cold War. For decades, the US operated under the assumption that Latin America was a natural sphere of influence, a region where American hegemony was so deeply embedded that it didn't need constant maintenance. That assumption was always flawed, but it was convenient. It allowed policymakers to focus on the Middle East, on China, on Russia, while treating Latin America as a backwater where the occasional coup or drug war could be managed with a mix of sanctions, DEA raids, and empty rhetoric about democracy. The problem is that the world has changed, and Washington hasn't. Let me explain why this matters. The US has two broad options in Latin America, and neither is particularly appealing. The first is to double down on the status quo: more sanctions, more regime change rhetoric, more half-hearted attempts to prop up opposition figures who have no real base of support. This is the path of least resistance, the one that plays well to domestic audiences but does nothing to address the root causes of American decline in the region. The second option is to fundamentally rethink America's approach, to accept that the Monroe Doctrine is dead, that Latin America is no longer a passive recipient of US policy, and that the only way to counter Chinese and Russian influence is to offer something better. That means trade, investment, and security cooperation that doesn't come with the kind of strings that make Latin American leaders roll their eyes every time a US official mentions human rights. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not prepared for either of these options. The first requires no real effort, no political capital, no difficult choices, just the same old playbook that has failed for 20 years. The second requires something Washington has lost: the capacity, strategic patience. It means accepting that engagement with Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua isn't a reward for bad behavior but a recognition that isolating these countries only pushes them further into the arms of America's adversaries. It means acknowledging that the US can't lecture Brazil about Amazon deforestation while ignoring its own environmental record, or scold Mexico about migration while refusing to address the root causes of the crisis. And it means understanding that Latin America's turn toward China isn't just about money, it's about dignity. For too long, the US has treated the region as a junior partner, not an equal. China, for all its faults, at least pretends to respect sovereignty. Take the case of Argentina. In 2023, Javier Milei won the presidency on a wave of anti-establishment fury, promising to dollarize the economy and break with the country's Peronist past. The US cheered, seeing him as a natural ally. But within months, Milei was courting China, signing deals to EXD lithium exports and even flirting with joining BRICS. Why? Because Argentina needs cash, and the US isn't offering enough. The IMF, which is dominated by US influence, has been squeezing Argentina for years with austerity measures that have only deepened its economic crisis. China, meanwhile, is offering loans with fewer conditions. This isn't about ideology, it's about survival. And if the US can't compete on those terms, it will keep losing. The same dynamic is playing out across the region. In Bolivia, China has become the largest investor in lithium, a critical resource for the energy transition. In Ecuador, Chinese loans have financed infrastructure projects that the US and its allies refuse to fund. In AMA, Chinese commies now control the largest ports on both ends of the AMA canal. And in Venezuela, China and Russia have stepped in where the US has stepped out, providing everything from oil investments to military hardware. The message is, if the US won't engage, someone else will. So what's the alternative? The US could start by recognizing that its current approach is a dead end. Sanctions have failed to topple Maduro, just as they failed to topple Castro or Ortega. Regime change is a fantasy, and the longer the US clings to it, the more irrelevant it becomes. Instead, Washington should focus on free economic engagement, security cooperation, and diplomatic pragmatism. First, the US needs to offer Latin America a real economic alternative to China. That means reviving the kind of trade deals that were once a cornerstone of US policy in the region. The Trump administration's decision to scrap the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a gift to Beijing, which has since filled the void with its own trade agreements. The Biden administration has talked about a Build Back Better World initiative, but it's been slow to materialize. Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative has signed up nearly every country in Latin America. The US doesn't need to match China dollar for dollar, but it does need to offer something more than lectures about debt traps and environmental standards. Second, the US needs to rethink its security cooperation. For decades, the Pentagon has treated Latin America as a counter-narcotics theater, flooding the region with DEA agents and military advisors. But the drug war has failed, and the US needs a new approach. That means working with Latin American militaries to address real threats like transnational crime and climate change rather than treating them as proxies in a failed war. It also means accepting that some countries, like Venezuela, will never be US allies, but that doesn't mean they have to be enemies. The US has managed to coexist with far more dangerous regimes. There's no reason it can't do the same with Maduro. Finally, the US needs to embrace diplomatic pragmatism. That means engaging with governments it doesn't like, whether it's Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua. It means recognizing that the alternative to engagement isn't isolation, it's irrelevance. The US has spent years trying to isolate Venezuela, only to watch as Maduro has become more entrenched and more defiant. Meanwhile, China and Russia have stepped in to fill the void. If the US wants to counter their influence, it needs to be in the room, not on the sidelines. None of this will be easy. The US political system is not designed for strategic thinking, especially when it comes to Latin America. The region is a low priority for most policymakers, and the few who do care are often trapped in outdated Cold War mindsets. But the cost of inaction is rising. Every year that the US treats Latin America as an afterthought is another year that China and Russia extend their influence. Every year that Washington clings to failed policies is another year that the US loses ground. The question is whether the US will wake up before it's too late. History suggests that it won't, not until a crisis forces its hand. And by then, it may be too late to reverse the damage. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The question is whether the US will bury it, or keep pretending it's still alive.